They started to drink more alcohol? Had they changed something in their houses? Maybe everyone had bought the same type of carpet or the same type of car, or what was it? And they could not find any common denominator. And Magnus and Zeno knew. They were standing on the square in this town, and you know, in Greece it's a very hilly type of landscape. So when they stood on the square there, they looked up on some of the mountains around them, and then they saw an antenna park. That is several antennae for radio, TV, and wireless telecommunication systems. And they thought, could the irradiation of the town from this antenna park be the common denominator? And you know, people are very difficult to work with. People are leaving, they should heads and so on, so they realized that was very hard to standardize, so they took mice. And mice were subjected to the radiation, which was very low level, placed approximately 2 kilometers away, 2 kilometers away from this antenna park. And then they looked at their offspring, the babies that were born. And I will ask you, do you think something happened with the first generation of babies? Mother and father had been exposed from the radiation of this antenna park. Do you think anything happened to the babies? Were they fewer? Did they look more ugly? Were they, some of them, dead? No, nothing happened. And they looked in the second generation, nothing happened. They looked in the third generation, nothing happened. They looked in the fourth generation, and practically nothing happened. If they had stopped there, no one could have accused Magnus and Zeno for being anything than very accurate. And also they would have a lot of mice to take care of, you know. But they looked a fifth time. And it turned out that in the fifth generation, and if you extrapolate that to leixlip, that would mean men and women in about 150 years ahead of us could not any longer get any babies. The mice had become irreversibly infertile. And that's interesting, because that's very common, as you know, in genetics. You don't see it in the very first generation, or not even in the very first 10 generation, or 100, depending on what you're looking for. But in the fifth generation, something quite dramatic happened. And you know, 150 years ahead of us, it's very hard to call someone and say, please, could you turn that off? Because in 150 years of time, we will not be able to get babies any longer. It's just too late to say that you are sorry. And the interesting thing is that mice, rats, and other rodents generally are much more resistant to radiation than human beings. And maybe we'll see effects very quickly than this. And I could just say that in many countries, in Europe, for instance, including Sweden, the number of offsprings of babies, human babies, are dramatically going down for a reason that is not clarified. And I will come back to that. Maybe this does play a role. We will have to think about it. Blood-brain barrier leakage in rats that have been exposed to GSM, mobile phone microwaves. And this is at an exposure level that is 5,000 times below what you should be able to take. 400 microwatts per kilogram. And I'm a neuroscientist, and believe me, if there is something you just don't want to have, that's a leakage in your blood-brain barrier. And the thing is interesting, because when we talk 400 microwatts per kilogram, that affects everyone. You are sitting in that right now. That's the public exposure level from base stations. Even if you don't own a mobile phone, you are still exposed 24/7 to somewhere between 20 up to 600 microwatts per kilogram. So most likely you do have leakages of your blood-brain barrier. But it's hard for us scientists to really investigate that, because at least in Sweden it's forbidden to chop off the head of people, open their skull, take out the brain, slice it and look in the microscope. So we don't know. Because the blood-brain barrier is exactly the same in rats and humans. These scientists in Lund, in the southern part of Sweden, they got the question, leakage of the blood-brain barrier, that's horrendous, but what about the central nervous system, the brain, the places where it leaks? How does the brain cells, the neurons, how does these cells look like? And they said, looked at the leakage, so they went back and made new experiments, and it turned out that they had in these areas. That's really very scary. And just recently, some 2-3 mobile phone use for 1 month, 1 hour a day for 1 month, and they could show that in a particular area of the brain called the hippocampus, they had a decrease in neuronal cell number, and that's the area where you have your short-term memory. Who showed that rats in the maze got an impaired short-term memory. What happens within the particular area of the brain? And again, we are talking about low exposure levels. In this particular experiment, to get the cell damage and cell death, it was enough with 1 minute of single effect. A very interesting area is effects on so-called mast cells. And mast cells has nothing to do with telecom masts or anything like that. German pathologists in the 1870s, they look pretty fat, and in German that's called mastig. And if you irradiate mast cells at so-called non-thermal level, very low exposure levels, they in the 1990s. So these cells, they don't like to use mobile phones. And that's very cell type for, at least in Sweden, the largest public health problem. Which problem is that? By far, ocean in countries like Sweden.